For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Michael Drewett and Lucilla Spini joined me to discuss their book, Johnny Clegg, Critical Reflections on His Music and Influence, a collection of essays exploring the life and legacy of an artist who reshaped South Africa's musical and political landscape. Lucilla, could you start by telling us about Johnny Clegg's early life, including how he began learning classical guitar, which marked the start of his remarkable musical journey into Zulu street guitar, war dancing, and his deep engagement with Zulu culture and language?
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. Happy to talk about Johnny Clegg. And his early life is as rich as his later life that is maybe more known to the wider public because of concert and performance. So Johnny Clegg was actually born in England on June 7, 1953. And actually, his childhood was full of traveling experience. His mother was moving around in different countries in Africa, but then he settled in South Africa. So most of his schooling was actually in South Africa. He was exposed to music. Some of you might not know, but his mother was a jazz singer. And so since an early age, he was exposed to not only music, but also touring, the fact that his mother was on tours, there were musicians at his home and things. And he actually started studying classical guitar. And some of his, you will see maybe on the internet, some of the videos, you'll see how he recalls, studying classical guitars with, all the postures and things. But then one day when he went to get bread and milk at a local shop around the corner, he saw Zulu musician, street musician, Charlie Mzila. He was 14 and he was fascinated about the different ways of playing Zulu guitar. And so he decided that he wanted to learn that. But he actually asked this person to teach him. And this was a crucial moment for changing his view of South African culture and what also the country had to offer in terms of different cultural setup, different cultural framework. And we never actually acknowledged the other side, but Charlie Mzila decided to accept and to teach this little kid to play Zulu guitar. And then the story goes on, and he started to interact with more and more with the Zulu musicians and with the Zulu community in Johannesburg.
Lucilla, could you go on to explain that in the 1970s, Johnny Clegg and Sipho Mchunu began performing as Jonathan and Sipho, and later as Juluka? Could you speak about that period and how they managed to perform despite the severe restrictions imposed by the apartheid government?
Yeah, so through Charlie Mzila that we mentioned before, this encounter at the age of 14, Johnny meets other people in the Zulu community. And in 1969, I believe, he met Sipho, and there starts a friendship and a musical partnership. Their point of contact was music. They were on different tracks in the apartheid system. Johnny would have gone then to university to study anthropology. Sipho was a gardener when he met Johnny. Johnny was still in high school, of course. They were kids. They were constrained by the apartheid system. But, as young people, often when they see obstacles, they try to open up places where they could actually interact. And so they start exchanging different music style. Johnny learned so many things from Sipho, and they start a music career, unbelievably, because, people could not actually perform together from different groups. And so they find what Johnny calls, and this is also explained in some of the chapters in our book, holes in the fence. So those places where they could actually play together and also to start mixing music. And this is there are great photos in the book about the early concert. You see young Johnny and young Sipho in the 70s. So those who loves that period, it's fantastic to see. Some, for example, the concert were at the Market Cafe, some were at the Free People's Concert at Wits, where there were this sort of neutral ground where things can happen and different groups of society could actually come together. And what I found very interesting is that they were able to mix their experience, their very different experience in some of the songs. the first debut album was Universal Man. Now, Universal Man is a highly sociological, I think, anthropological album inspired on Johnny's side from John Berger's book, A Seventh Man, for example, and from his academic perspective, but also bringing the migrant labor perspective brought by Sipho and how this will join. And there are many, many songs from that time which are still played today, like Woza Friday, for example. Or if you think you don't know some of the song, remember Impi, I think is something that is widely played in South Africa as well. That friendship continue. Of course, Juluka was a project that ended in 1984, 85 with Sipho going back to his home. But after the apartheid system finished in 1994, they actually came together again with Crocodile Love. And then in the final journey tour, Sipho was next to his brother Johnny in helping him to say goodbye to his audience. So it was a real friendship. It was not a marketing or a musical company experience, but it was a real friendship.
Michael, from the outset, Johnny Clegg and Sipho Mchunu's music reflected the lives and struggles of working people. As Lucilla has spoken about, their early single, Woza Friday, was a workers' love song, looking forward to the weekend. Could you tell us more about this song? And could you also talk about their debut album, Universal Men, which explored the theme of migrant labor?
Yeah, sure. The thing about Johnny Clegg's music was that he was immersed in the whole migrant labor system. He would go and dance on weekends. He would play music with people. And he and Sipho were very good friends as well. He went to the rural area where Sipho was from, and he experienced the struggles of migrant workers in particular, but also workers in general in the urban areas. So he was actually working at a chicken factory himself, or chicken plant or something. When he wrote Woza Friday, it was an awareness of how important the weekend was as a space to reconstitute oneself after a very, very tough, not just the work process itself, but the way you treated, the way you dehumanized in the apartheid system as a worker, and how the weekend becomes your own space where maybe you can try and rediscover yourself and try and enjoy yourself. So was a Friday, my darling, my weekend, where the weekend becomes your lover in a way that you look forward to seeing at the end of the week. In Universal Men, and just to point out that Richard Pitthouse has a really good chapter in the book on Johnny Clegg and his relationship with workers and worker politics and so on. So he explores those themes not only on Universal Men, but on later albums as well, right through the whole Juluka period. There's a lot of songs about work issues like African Sky Blue, where the warrior's now a worker and his war is underground. So it's a really good line about how people are taken from their Zulu culture in the rural area into the urban area and down into their minds. And he talks about songs about a person watching their child grow older on the station platform. Very, very powerful images around migrant labor. So those are all things that were explored in his music, and also which Richard touches on quite strongly in his chapter.
Please can you tell us about Johnny Clegg's emergence onto the international stage in 1983 with the release of the song Scatterlings of Africa? Could you also tell us about his song Asimbo Nanga, released in 1986?
Oh, yes. Great song. First of all, allow me to say that there's no favorite song for Johnny Clegg, but they're all fantastic. But Scatterlings of Africa is one that is sometimes is considered as, if I may, as a national anthem for the community of fans, which define themselves as scatterlings all around the world. So if you go to France, if you go to the US, and you mentioned Johnny Clegg, Scatterlings of Africa, and Asimbo Nanga will come as the first song that came to mind. So Johnny and Sipho, through their friendship, which was very local friendship in Johannesburg, as Michael was saying about the migrant labor workers environment, the hostels and things, but actually they had an international tour, so as Juluka already, 1982, 1983, including playing in New York City and in New Haven at Toad's Place, so very famous. And also in Europe, through the Celluloid record company, they start also releasing records in Europe. And so Scatterlings of Africa get an international exposure, which will culminate. I mean, the peak of international exposure can be defined, and this is also described by Caleb Much in the book, with the inclusion of the second edition of Scatterlings of Africa, which is the one by Johnny Clegg and Juluka, which featured in Third World Child in 1987. The song will be featured in Rain Man, which has been an amazing film, a very famous film. And so through that also, Johnny Clegg gets an international exposure and recognitions in the US and Europe. So at that moment, and these were also the year where in Europe and in the United States, there were great events also for the anti-apartheid movement, different types of approaches. But so Scatterlings of Africa becomes an established song in terms of world music, also in terms of the video that was going with it, highlighting some of the images from South Africa, so bringing it a different perspective. And what the song is really great about that, it describes this journey, this journey of humanity, but also the common ancestry. These were times also we were starting to think about the common origins of people, of humankind in Africa. So again, the anthropological perspective creeps in also in that song. And in our book, there are many different authors actually who talks about Scatterlings of Africa. So I invite everybody to pick different things. And Martina Villogen describe the text and the lyrics, and each of us should actually find its own meaning because it's a song for everybody. But also Caleb Much and Chris Letcher, they all try to dig in. And it's a song as contemporary as it was when it was first released in 1982. Asimbonanga, sometimes in Europe, we call it the Mandela song for many different reasons. And again, you'll discover things that you probably would not know about Asimbonanga in the book because its origin dates back in 1970s. It was a different song that Johnny and Sipho were actually performed. It had a different political slant, but I will not go into details. I would like the reader to discover. What I would like to touch is really how important, this is also from Third World Child album from the Johnny Clegg and Savuka. And there are many different stories about how that also developed in its afterlives. For example, Nicole Ammond talks about how the song has been taken and covered, for example, by the Soweto Gospel Choir, by Karen Zoid and Snotkop. And so how that song has been heritagized in the South African culture. It's not just a song for Mandela, which has a time in history, but how that has been also taken up by the community in South Africa as part of their common heritage. In the apartheid years, the song also was a vehicle for getting information about what was happening in South Africa and making sure that people would know, for example, about Neil Agate or Stephen Biko as well. So it was sort of a maximized social media song in the sense that there was communicating a lot of information about Nelson Mandela and about the anti-apartheid struggle. And I like to just put a little anecdote. I went to a conference and the South African group were performing to say next conference will be in South Africa. Asimbonanga was part of that traditional song repertoire. So it's really an heritage song.
Michael, Johnny Clegg completed an honours degree in anthropology at the University of the Witwatersrand and was devastated by the assassination of his mentor, Dr. David Webster, by the apartheid security forces in 1989. Could you talk about Clegg's political activism and how his songs captured a profound sense of humanism and solidarity with the marginalized?
I think he actually had a master's degree at Wits. He was, right from the mid-70s onwards, there's signs that he was very interested and involved in the South African political situation. He experienced it firsthand with his difficulties and who he could spend time with, where he could go and things like that, around being a white person going into compounds and so on. And although Johnny Clegg said that Juluka was very much a cultural experiment or experience more than political, there's a lot of politics in those songs. So when he takes up work issues, those become immediately political issues. So not only through the lyrics, but the fact that he and Sipho and the band were of different races performing in areas where that might not necessarily have been allowed previously. Sometimes he wasn't allowed to perform in places and so on. So, both lyrically, the fact that the band itself was political, and then he became more overtly political, probably with the Work for All album, with songs like Mdansani. And definitely, by the time Savuka got going, they were dealing with political issues directly, right through until the final Savuka album. Their political issues which are dealt with along the way, including David Webster's assassination and so on. So that was a very important part of who he was, and he took a stand on that. And those are issues that do come up in the book. Different chapters deal with the kind of political nature of Johnny Clegg's music and his involvement.
Lucilla, could you speak to us about Johnny Clegg's experiences in France during the 1980s, as well as his time in the United States, including his creative non-fiction style of teaching?
Yeah, thank you for that. That brings me back to my childhood, actually. Thanks to France, I actually got exposed to Johnny Clegg because he became famous in Europe because of the role that France had in launching this amazing artist. So so we talked about before that Juluka had already had a tour, an international tour, and some exposure. There was a record company in France actually releasing some of these records. But actually, the turning points for getting Johnny Clegg known in France was an article in a magazine which is called Actuel, it was called Actuel, by journalist Christopher Nick, who actually went to South Africa in 1985 and talked to Johnny Clegg, and actually a fantastic piece talking about also Johnny and Sipho friendship and music and the situation there in South Africa and in that time. And that got the public curious about Johnny Clegg, about Les Zulu Blancs, the white Zulu, and that's how it's still known in France and in the broader European community. And his debut in terms of performance was in 1986 at the Festival of Musique Métisse in Angoulême, which was sort of the prime stage for world music, where music was really on at that time, was really getting a good chunk of attention in France. From that, he was invited also to perform through the Francophone community at the Senegal concert, an anti-apartheid event later on in 1986. And at that point there, you start that sort of interaction with Claude Cis, who later become Johnny Clegg's manager for France and for Europe. And they started to get him more known in France through performance. But thanks also to an amazing musician, Renaud, a great friend of Johnny, of course, who also actually wrote a song. So for those who are interested in how artists help each other as well, it's fantastic. Who also wrote a song called Jonathan, who explained to the French public really the way of Johnny fight, if I may say, against apartheid, and the fact that he got not a gun, but a guitar to combat the segregation system, really. And so from that, there's going to be a documentary where Renaud come to South Africa. Renaud says that he was very scared, but actually they could not film anything. But they managed to get images. So Renaud went into the hostels and actually learned about stick fighting, and they discussed the politics and stuff. So that documentary is actually on the web. If you get the book, you'll see the link and you could actually watch and get a feel for what it was, the situation at the time. And there's great music to it. And in France, it's still very much known. Many generations actually have been listening to Johnny Clegg. And he actually spoke a little bit of French, and the French public love Johnny, as they say, because he was actually very interested also in the culture, the language, and understanding also, the political situation and things. So it's a good partnership, the one between Johnny Clegg and France. In the United States, the interaction are a bit different, but they're very interesting because they involve the academia. So we talked about Johnny Clegg being a Wits student, but also being a lecturer. So in his early years, he was a lecturer of anthropology, which was not an easy subject in the apartheid system. In South Africa, anthropology could be very controversial. So in the United States, he developed some connections, and in particular, one of the author of one of the chapter, Professor Andrew Friedland at Dartmouth, so one of the most famous universities in the United States, he get calls to give lectures, maybe before concerts, in different classes from environmental science to African studies and so on. He was even awarded an honorary doctor in 2012, among the many honorary doctor that he got. And at some point, he was invited as Montgomery Fellow in 2014, I believe. And there, finally, there is every fellowship has a flagship lecture that you have to give to the broader university. And we have recording of that lecture. So with Andrew Friedland, we analyzed that lecture and we identified this creative nonfiction style of teaching, which some of you might actually be a little bit familiar if you've been to a concert. The storytelling of the concert was as popular as the songs part of the concert and the dance, of course. And so we analyzed and we looked that he actually didn't do sort of a more formal academic lecture with introduction, the body and the conclusion and in chronological order and things, but he actually developed different narratives. And so this style is about, we use some literature perspective and style and methodology by interweaving different narratives and proposing interlinkages. This allows him also to include some of the anecdotes in the lecture, so to actually get empathy with the audience, so putting his personal touch to it. But also this style, which provides many different hints about, for example, in this lecture, identity, music, activism. He goes back and forth on this type of issues and try to put them together at the end. But at the end of the lecture, actually, close this type of style as somebody who's kind of finishing the first volume of a series of book, sort of like, I gave you enough of curiosity now, and I'm going to point out that my music actually reflects all the issues that we discuss. And so leave the audience with that kind of like hunger for finding out more. At the same time, Johnny Clegg was a clever academic in the sense that he put different words about different theory and academic theory and stuff like that to get those academic thinking, he knows his stuff. It's not just a musician, giving not a lecture, but as he liked to call this lecture, conversation. Always this mutual understanding is also embedded into that. So great lecture. I invite everybody to actually read about in the book, but also to actually listen to the lecture online.
Michael, praise names in Zulu culture can be deeply expressive and often used for clans and royalty, sometimes flattering, sometimes teasing when applied to individuals. Could you share with us the praise names given to Johnny Clegg?
This is a topic best left to read about in the book. There's a chapter by Andrew Ennis and Sipho Mchunu which looks at these different praise names and explores what they mean. I'm not a Zulu speaker, so I'm not even going to try to go through those names. But they deal with all sorts of parts of one's life. They're things that pop up that people think are important or joke about, from the size of Johnny's ears to his stick fighting ability to his position in the white community, things like that. So those are all captured in those names, and it's a fascinating chapter to read. So I would simply say go and read the chapter if anyone is interested in that. It's really, really well described and explained there.
And finally, your book's contributors reflect on Johnny Clegg as a scholar, activist, and performer. What would you both like readers to take away from this book and from Johnny Clegg's legacy?
Well, just to explain that the way the book developed was a call for chapters, which we had a few people responded, and Lucilla was one. And Lucilla actually had so many ideas of people to contact and track down that we ended up co-editing the book because of of all of her important contributions that she was making. And so we actually, in a sense, approached some people, and everybody who took part with an idea that they wanted to explore. We might have suggested initially, do you want to write something about this issue? For example, Chris Letcher is a person who does film music, and he writes about that. So we asked him what he could do. And so no one was dictated to. And I think you get a real passion in the book from what different people say. So we don't touch on every area. We try and cover quite a lot of areas, but it's not a biographical book. It's simply different people approaching from Johnny Clegg's life and his influence from different disciplines, from different perspectives, but everybody being quite passionate about his music and about how they feel about him. So I think that's what I'm hoping people will get from the book, is that sense from each chapter of somebody engaging with something that's really important to them, and which leaves some sense of how important and influential Johnny Clegg as a person and as a musician and dancer was, and is.
Yeah, if I may add on, first of all, thank you, Michael. First of all, I would like to say, yes, it was a very creative process, putting people together. And I think Ancestor Clegg would be somehow happy in a way, because one of his wishes was to continue to bring people together. And this book has been a great experience to be able to work with people, in South Africa, in Italy, people in the UK, people in the United States. We actually never met together, but we developed great friendship and linkages. And during the book, allow me to say, and it was a great opportunity to find out more about Clegg. And so most of us many of us, so probably all of us are fans. And so we discovered different things. So it was fantastic. And also the fact that Wits University Press was very supportive in terms of leaving us this creative approach while written in academic. What I really would like to say, that this is a book for different type of audience, because it's about human stories. There are academic, of course, reflection, consideration for people dealing with music, people dealing with anthropology, people dealing with histories and things like that. But it's really a human story that hopefully this book will inspire other people to continue our research. There are many, not all the dimension of Johnny's life. Johnny was, I call it, as a Renaissance man. So there were many other things that are not being covered in the book. So maybe this could give some idea of undergraduate student or graduate student, or maybe teachers, to do projects on different aspects of his life, like his focus on education, his focus on environmental protection, and so on. So I really hope that the book sparks other ideas, and maybe, who knows, other amazing friendship like the one that Johnny and Sipho taught us, and that different human stories can actually have great impact on geopolitical context. And we need human story at this point.
That was Lucilla, Spini and Michael Drewett discussing their book, Johnny Clegg, Critical Reflections on His Music and Influence. Visit the Polity website to access more author interviews, news and information updates. If you haven't already, subscribe to Polity's email services, including our new monthly Polity Bookshelf email, to stay informed about the latest news and Polity Bookshelf developments.